Yes. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but my therapist is on vacation, so thank you for all of that love and applause. It is much appreciated. It is time for our closing panel of the day, where we get to have a Q&A with you, the audience, and the science-based medicine rock stars who you've had the opportunity to hear from today. We have another mic if you want. Well, I'm not even upset. I'm teasing because you know what happens? This has been an amazing day, and we are meeting really cool people, and we're having great conversations. So I'm not mad at that. I'm really not. I so get it. I really do. But I'm going to bring on stage the folks who are going to have a Q&A with you. And again, these are the folks that you've had an opportunity to hear from today, and now we get to ask questions directly. And this is a great opportunity. So please welcome to the stage Harriet Skep Doc Hall, Mr. Good Thinking Michael Marshall, Clay Skeptic Petty Jones, David Babylon 5 Gorski, our skeptic dentist Grant Ritchie, and Mr. Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Stephen Novella.
Well, thanks again for joining us for the Science-Based Medicine today at NECSS, at the 10th NECSS. This is your opportunity to ask us anything. It doesn't have to be medical, but it probably should be. And we'll make up answers. So that's how this panel works. So go ahead.
Clay, how do you objectively count number of ticks? If some sufferers of Tourette's can control them or can control them when they're being studied, I'm over here, control them when they're being studied, or sometimes just learn to ignore them because it's so frequent, how does one objectively count them? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I don't think you can, or at least it's not very easy. Right, well, I mean, other people around you might certainly be able to notice, friends or family members. And certainly if you go from having severe Tourette's to, if there's a significant drop, I think that's pretty easy to tell. But any subtle, mild to moderate improvements could be potentially difficult to determine unless, again, you're having yourself videotaped and you're going through there painstakingly marking each tick, which the studies aren't generally doing that.
They use like a lot of quality of life scales.
Quality of life is a huge, yeah, exactly.
Which kind of makes sense too, because you think if you're going for a clinical outcome, you're looking for changes that the person will notice and will actually affect their quality of life, right? So if it's less than that, who cares anyway, right? So in a way that makes sense.
But that's also where a lot of placebo can come in.
Yeah.
Because if it's all self-reported, I think, using the dental appliance, I think probably most people, they want it to work so badly that if you give them a quality of life type of questionnaire, at least initially they will say, oh yeah, I think I'm feeling a lot better.
Right, that's why it has to be blinded.
Right.
Or you need some kind of comparison that will control for the placebo effect. So then it's okay. If you have a really well-blinded trial, then using subjective outcomes is reasonable. It's always better to have objective markers, like counting ticks would be great, but that's only semi-objective because then it's like what counts as a tick.
Right.
And then you could get around it by having multiple observers and resolve different, whatever. You could try to get it as objective as possible. But I don't know that people are bothering to do that. I think they're mainly using, Did you notice that it decreased, your ticks?
So what, if any, is the data about the effects of marijuana and the action time? Like, especially I'm thinking about driving while high. I mean, how much of an effect does it have on your reaction time if you're driving a car?
You guys have any off the top?
Personal experience?
No, not or.
Maybe ask
I mean,
Grant.
I know the conventional wisdom is that you're impaired, if you're high while you're driving, but that's as much to do with judgment as reaction time. But I don't know what the objective data is on reaction time specifically with marijuana. Does anybody know offhand?
I drove just fine.
Yeah. Not talking anecdotal.
Okay.
But I mean, isn't it safe to assume that it's going to impair your ability to safely drive?
Yeah, I think legally you would be considered impaired. Yeah.
But we don't have any kind of determination of legal limits. There's no like blood marijuana levels to be able to, or any kind of
Yeah, I don't think
data
there's
on
anything
this, right?
specific like that. Yeah.
Hi, this is for Clay. You mentioned about Tourette's, the behavioral therapy for children. What is the most current prescription for the behavioral therapy?
Well, first off, there's not great data that things like cognitive behavioral therapy or habit reversal training, which are the main approaches, have great benefit. It could be better than nothing, and no one would fault someone for trying those things, but the evidence is clear that the medications work better. But it's cognitive behavioral therapy, so it's essentially, can you hear me? Okay, so you're trying to train people to rethink about the way that they feel about their Tourette's, and if you can do that in such a way that they are less bothered by them, less stressed, that can reduce the tics. And then habit reversal training is a little bit more squirrely. I read about it, and I had a lot of trouble wrapping my head around it. It's essentially when you feel the urge to do the tic, then doing a different movement to somehow get you to break that cycle. I don't know how that works. It didn't make sense to me. And the evidence doesn't show that it's particularly helpful. But if you're opposed to medications, or if the medications aren't working great, then I don't think it's harmful.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but Steve lost 50 pounds. No. Sorry. Okay, sorry. If you could magically snap your fingers and eliminate one quack therapy, what would you get rid of? What is, in other words, what do you think is causing the most damage in terms of quack therapies?
Why don't we start here and go down?
Thank you.
I would have to say bogus cancer cures.
Hey, wait, that's my...
Yeah, count me in for that as well, yeah.
That's the benefit of getting to sit next to Steve.
One of the many benefits,
One
yeah.
of the many benefits. And now there's more room for me because he's lost a lot of...
Yeah, I mean, bogus cancer therapies, but in particular, the really popular ones, like the Gerson therapy, which of course involves the use of 5 coffee enemas a day and many supplements, many juices. Actually, the therapy is rather interesting in that it basically involves 13 big glasses of fresh vegetable and fruit juice a day. So you have to fresh grind them. So you have to be doing this, 13 plus hours a day. 5 coffee enemas, about 100 supplements plus per day. I mean, pills. So you're already selecting for people who can do that.
Right.
But in any case, yeah, bogus cancer therapies.
One thing that annoys me, chiropractors occasionally can cause strokes, and that's pretty rare, but they do a lot of damage by discouraging immunizations, and chiropractors and naturopaths patients are much less likely than the general population to have gotten the required vaccinations, so they're hurting our herd immunity and our public health, and I really object to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree that anti-vaccination is a huge thing that I'd want to see rid of, but I think the Gerson therapy is a big one for me. I unfortunately had to, I attended a Gerson conference in my hometown, where I live now in Liverpool, and there were 100 or so people in the room, and during the course of the conversation and the presentation, the questions, maybe 30 or 40 of them said that they had cancer. And we have the chap up on stage who is one of yours, Patrick Vickers, came over to sell his therapy to these people. And he's directly telling people in the audience, what chemotherapy are you on? Yeah, you're going to have to stop taking that before you start to Gerson. And directly telling them in that room to stop taking their legitimate medicine and to instead follow his his regime. And if you can't follow the regime, it's your own fault. If it goes wrong, it's your own fault.
How did you restrain yourself? I would have been escorted out just like
Yeah, well,
the story
I
I told in my
restrained
talk.
myself by spending the entire time tweeting a local journalist pictures of exactly what was going on to try and get them to investigate that. And unfortunately, they couldn't use my audio recording. They couldn't use my report for it I wrote for the UK Skeptic magazine. But we did look for the next time Patrick Vickers was in town, and that was the 1st of July, so it was literally just been. And we had a journalist there from The Sun do an undercover piece, and that's going to be published on Monday, I think, and it should be hopefully a big piece with quotes from the regulators to try and really stamp down on this. So yeah, going there to learn about it helped. Fingers crossed it'll go out. It was supposed to go out a week ago, but England kept winning World Cup games, and that kept being front page. It's like, come on, guys, go out quicker so we get our scoop in.
So what makes me the most angry on a deep kind of gut level is newborn and infant chiropractic. But, thank you. But if I had to pick one that I think maybe causes the most harm or chips away at kind of just the public understanding of what good medicine and good science is, it's the one that provides the most cover for quackery. It's the one that is often the foot in the door for people, even for otherwise well-meaning physicians, and that's acupuncture.
Yeah, so I think you guys have mentioned all the ones that will be on my short list. Definitely chiropractic, naturopaths, acupuncture, cancer quackery. I'll just add to that the one that it's probably not the most harmful in and of itself, but involves the greatest number of people and use, and that is herbalism and nutritional. If you count that as a category, it dwarfs everything else in terms of number of people. But each individual instance is probably not much more benign than certainly depending on a fake cancer cure. But that's certainly a huge category.
And of course, the topic of my talk, those bogus stem cell clinics.
Yeah.
Hi, this question's for Harriet Hall. I want to know if during your research you found any significant differences in the demographic of people that were taking the vaccinations. And if you did, do you think it's a socioeconomic factor or just a separate belief system?
I haven't seen any statistics on that, but for vaccinations in general, it seems that the people who are rejecting vaccines tend to be some of the most educated people.
Right, because it correlates best with disposable income, which correlates with high socioeconomic status, which correlates with being educated. It probably isn't the being educated that
Also, conspiratorial thinking is like another correlation that's been found.
So things that are, I feel like you can deny, like ADHD and autism, why is it that the measures that we have are quantitative and not, what's the difficulty of making quantitative, gathering quantitative evidence that somebody cannot deny?
So you're just talking about, like, does ADHD exist, and why don't we have quantitative data? Well, we do. It depends on what you're looking for. So there is quantitative data, but it involves outcomes, markers. Like for ADHD, there's studies showing that people with ADHD make less money over the course of their lifetime, have a greater statistical chance of ending up in jail, of getting divorced, of losing their job, of being homeless. So there are quantitative statistics about life outcomes that correlate very strongly with meeting the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. In terms of the diagnostic criteria themselves, the problem is you're dealing with human behavior, which is very hard to quantify. And a lot of the research is literally called qualitative research, or we're looking at things that require some clinical judgment, right? Like, being, like you talked, like, how do you count tics? So, like, how do you count fidgetiness, or things like that? Like, there's things that just require observational sort of judgment calls, and you know what I mean? So it's hard to quantify. That's one thing that scientists struggle with, is trying to study things that are difficult to quantify, because they exist along a continuum, or there's a lot of perception involved. And so then your two options are you use some kind of pseudo-quantifiable scale and as objective as possible observers, or you use quantifiable markers, where it's not the thing itself, but it's correlating with the thing. And so that's why we look at quantifiable things like, what's the probability of winding up in jail, for example? But I don't think that that's at the heart of denialism about things like ADHD or mental illness or autism. I think there are other things at the heart of it. That's just one of the things that they use to backfill their justification for the denial. And like, for example, they'll say things like that, well, why can't we see it on an X-ray, right? You can't see pathology, it doesn't exist. It's like, well, we don't make that demand of other things in medicine. Like we think migraines exist in the absence of pathology. That's not controversial. Right, so it's sort of the fake controversy comes first, and then it looks for things to justify the denial. But if you put it into a full or a meaningful medical context, it doesn't make any sense. Does that answer your question? Does anybody else have anything to add on that? I'm kind of the neuroscientist on the panel.
All right. Going back to the Tourette's talk, when you had the halo of other symptoms such as ADHD and so on, I was curious about where stuttering falls into that, especially with the male to female ratio.
I'm not familiar with stuttering being, I haven't seen that that's been one of the comorbid conditions. I can see how there could be, some overlap in how it presents, like stuttering is a repetition of, I guess, fragments of words, but it's not the same as a tic. I don't think that there's an urge.
No, the neuroanatomical correlates are totally different for stuttering and for Tourette's. We don't fully understand stuttering, and there's definitely different subtypes, but the most recent data that I saw showed that in some people at least, there is literally, like if you imagine like there's a circuit from your frontal lobe going to your Broca's area, the language part of your brain, that's interfering. Like there are interference signals going from one part of your brain to the language part of your brain that's sort of breaking up your stream of talk, of speaking. So it's really just a wiring problem, but it's in a completely different part of the brain than Tourette's.
Hello. So it seems like a lot of homeopathic or pseudoscience sellers seem to be using studies, non-peer review, and scientific methods, your methods, and sometimes your data to prove why you're wrong and no one should listen to you, essentially. How much control do you have over the data that scientists produce, if any control, or do you have to rely on people like Michael to essentially enforce the truth? Or do you have any kind of say in that?
So if I understand the question is, what controls are there in terms of how scientific data is used or interpreted in the public sphere? I think the short answer is none, but
I was going to say I don't know.
Right, it's like data's in the public domain once it's published, and then anyone is free to interpret it any way they will. And journals that are open source, open access, everything is freely available, and there are some increasing regulations about the data. You have to make your data available. If you're doing publicly funded research on people, you got to make that data available. Right? I mean, you guys have anything to add about that? There's no control over that at any level.
Yeah, and I think sort of speaking to that, it's not so much that homeopaths use the studies conducted by, the best studies conducted by scientists and use them to disprove the scientific or evidence-based view of homeopathy. The bigger problem is the studies conducted by homeopaths, which are garbage, basically. There's lots of studies out there that are garbage. And so homeopaths can say, well, there's 200 studies about homeopathy, and this number of them show a positive effect. And it's like, yeah, but those don't have blinding, or they don't have a control, or there's a million other reasons. And when you look at the ones that are well conducted, you've got to throw away 90% or 80% or a high figure. So they see that as an aggressive form of cherry picking because, or they'll certainly paint it that way and will complain about it that way. And that's the bigger issue, is that it isn't the well-conducted studies being misused, it's the garbage studies being used more than anything else, I think.
And one of the hardest messages to get across is that in terms of studies, it's not the number of studies that matter so much, but the quality, the number of high-quality studies. And that's not how people think generally. They're susceptible to the argument that, well, okay, we have 200 studies of homeopathy here, but only 10 of them are good studies, and those 10 are negative, while all these 190 other ones show varying degrees of effect. It's hard to get the message across that that isn't a form of, like, cherry picking.
Yeah, but I don't know that people are convinced to use homeopathy based on the studies, whether they're positive or negative. I don't think
it's just an example.
No,
I could talk
absolutely,
about,
but I just don't think it comes up.
Anti-vax studies that say that it's correlated with autism or correlated with ADHD, correlated with autoimmune disease or what have you. It's the same situation.
No, it is absolutely right. But the only reason I was making that point was I think before. The reason when we did the 1023 campaign is that we didn't go near the studies side of it is because if you say this study proves homeopathy wrong, the homeopaths say, well, we've got a study over here, and your average person in the street hears 2 studies, isn't going to go away and read them, because who goes away and reads scientific studies? I mean, maybe some of you in the audience, but we are not a representative sample of wider society. So if we don't engage at the study level, but instead say, look, this is what homeopathy actually is. This is how it's made. There's nothing in it. Go away and read studies if you like, but remember there's nothing in it, and most people will recognize it doesn't work. So yeah, it's kind of moving away from the science as much as anything else.
I mean, it's a way of showing that it can't work. Which has.
Yeah, or at least kind of demonstrating the common sense,
right.
Understanding what it is, because homeopaths won't tell you there's nothing in it because that's so damaging to their whole field.
But homeopathy is at one end of the spectrum in terms of all the things that we deal with, in that it's pretty easy to demonstrate that it can't work. For most things that we deal with, it's harder to bury it just on that score, and then you end up having to look at the evidence. The clinical evidence, does it work, empirically, not just can it work. And there, it's like, this is what we talk about on science-based medicine. How do you know? How do you know if something works or not based on the scientific evidence? Not by citing a study that you like, or cherry-picking the studies, or misinterpreting the studies, or citing the crappy studies. You have to do multiple systematic analyses and look at the pattern of evidence. That's a hard thing to communicate, though, to a general audience. Right, and most people are not going to be able to do that anyway. You have to really rely on experts to do those kinds of reviews and to tell you what the literature shows. And so it really gets down to then who you're going to listen to. You're going to listen to multiple panels of experts, or Joe Quack trying to sell you something. So again, I think that's what the problem comes down to a lot of times, is what is your circle of trust? Not how are you interpreting the study. Most people aren't interpreting the study themselves.
Wouldn't it be nice if there were some regulatory body that could assess the quality of studies, and you could look up and say, this study is a 2 and this study is a 9? We don't have anything like that, but that's where science-based medicine comes in. We're trying to do that on our blog as much as we can.
Michael, you've done an amazing job, and I want to learn how you do it. Do you follow any methodologies or processes or anything that you could point out to, or is it just feeling your way through?
Oh God, I'm not sure really. So, yeah, I'm not sure you've ever analyzed it with that level of kind of self-scrutiny, but the thing that I showed kind of early on is the stuff that how we decide what we're going to do. We use kind of certain criteria. I think that's a big part of it. The communication aspect is the key thing for us as well, to make sure that we're explaining what we're doing the right way. But I'm not sure there's necessarily a process. It's very dependent on the particular project. So there'll be some things that I will go and do an undercover investigation and sit in an audience and really hear that all out and understand what's being said, and then use the media, the regulators, to take that information and to enact or enforce things. And that's kind of one side of it. But understanding what the regulations are to try and make complaints and things like that is another side. So I guess it depends. It's so dependent on what it is that we're talking about, really, that it's hard to say, here's the pattern, do this for everything and everything will be fine. If I had that, it'd be brilliant, but it's very dependent on the individual project, which is a really disappointing and boring answer, I think.
Have you ever considered moving to the United States and doing it for us here?
Yeah, I love the NHS way too much, and I don't think I can afford the healthcare. So,
well, and I'll put in another plug for Marsh because he didn't have time to go into it, but he's done a lot in the quite a bit in the dental field too, with the dental regulators, and
yeah, well, that's something that. With the dental work, you know, there is a chap in the UK who's a dentist, who's a skeptic, and he says he came to us and said, this is a concern, but I've got a full-time job. I can't do anything really about this. I can't really dedicate as much time to this, but I can tell you the kind of stuff that you need to be concerned about and the ways that the regulations work. And we were able to then say, okay, well, mercury-free. There shouldn't be dentists in the UK who are claiming that mercury is so harmful. The GDC, the General Dental Council, doesn't support that. So we got the GDC to write a letter to all dentists saying you can't make these claims that mercury is harmful. We made complaints about the dentists that we found and made phone calls to have them actually say to us, yeah, take your mercury fillings out because they're contributing to this, that, and the other. And we used that material to make a complaint, and you know, a couple of years later, that gets worked through. And so we rely very much on the insight of experts in their field who have all the expertise but don't have the time to dedicate to following this stuff through. And we just act as the legwork for that as much as anything else.
At the end of the Weeds panel, Steve mentioned that the vast majority of the research for the pharmaceuticals was done here in the United States versus elsewhere in the world. Is that an effect of the for-profit medical and pharmaceutical industry, and is it a bad thing?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's because we're funding a lot of the research. We pay more for our drugs because, for a number of regulatory reasons, but also because that's, you know, we're sort of subsidizing a lot of pharmaceutical research. And then yes, I mean, there are lots of companies that are multinational that are based in the UK or in Germany or in Europe, but you know, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily weighted in the US, and that is the way we are funding pharmaceutical research itself specifically. In fact, like the NIH, the government won't fund pharmaceutical research because they say that's the pharmaceutical industry's job, right? We give them, you know, patents and breaks and whatever so that they will fund it. So that's just the way it's being funded right now. Whether or not it's a good idea is, well, you have to consider what are the other options. The fact is, that's the system we have here, and we fund a tremendous amount of research. You could argue, well, that it's working. The system is funding a lot of research, producing a lot of new drugs. It just has to be carefully regulated and tweaked, and we have to look at it for trends and abuses, et cetera. I don't know of any other model that's working, that's producing a lot of drugs. I mean, what do you guys think about that? Is there anything else out there? What's the alternative? I don't know. There's no government doing that kind of research, for example. Well, I mean, the way I see it, it's always just trading one set of problems for another, right? You always pick your poison. There's always going to be strengths and weaknesses to any system like that you have. And then you're going to have to try to manage and regulate those, the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses. Certainly, like just saying, let's just have the government fund it isn't a panacea. It would just introduce an entirely new set of problems that we'd have to learn how to manage. And then, think about how susceptible that would be to tax cuts every year. And that's a lot of money. That would be a tremendous that'd be a huge shift of resources to a sort of a centralized model. Again, I mean, if there was evidence or experience to show that that works better, then great, but I don't know of one.
I mean, it's not entirely true that the NIH doesn't fund pharmaceutical research. They have a number of grant mechanisms that actually fund, SBIR grants, for instance, that fund startup companies that have an idea that, to develop that idea and turn it into a product. But it doesn't fund like the big sort of clinical trials so much.
My questions for the panelists who recently experienced a weight loss. I'm a dietitian and I missed your talk this morning. I was wondering if you would possibly give me a non-snarky answer for my students who all want to know what's wrong with clean eating?
Boil it down to like a couple minutes, 5 minutes or less.
So yeah, the talk this morning that I gave on clean eating was just, I mean, that's a marketing concept. It exists to create a health halo around something you're trying to market and to demonize whatever else there is out there, the competition. But if you look at each of the individual components of what then gets passed on as clean eating, none of them are evidence-based, none of them are science-based. Organic food is not more nutritious, safer, or healthier than conventional food. There's no safety issue with any GMOs that are currently on the market. There's, sucrose is sucrose regardless of the source. So obsessing over the source is irrelevant. And you can't assume that buying things locally is better for the environment because you have to look at the entire chain, of production distribution efficiencies, and they're very individual. You can't make any blanket statements about that one factor. So it's essentially a marketing notion that is not science-based, and you really should take a science-based approach to each specific question. And at the end of the day, and this is what we've been saying for decades, because it's true and it's still true, that for most people, the best advice if you want to be healthy is in terms of diet is to just have a varied diet, eat your fruits and vegetables, and don't eat too much. And if you just follow that advice, that's really all you need to know. And everything else is marketing and it's bullshit, and you shouldn't worry about it.
What is the history of science-based medicine and evidence-based medicine, and how those terms have come into play, and are they being taught to physicians and people in the medical field today?
So the term science-based medicine was made up by me when I started the website and invited everyone to blog with me on there. And it was essentially fixing what we perceived of. I mean, it did evolve out of the Scientific Review of Alternative Medicine, which is a journal that CSI runs, and other activity that we were doing, sort of coalescing this group of physicians who were perceiving the rise of alternative medicine and the problems with science in medicine. And science-based medicine just sort of when it crystallized into that. Essentially. And the short answer on what's the difference between science-based medicine and evidence-based medicine, science-based medicine considers overall scientific plausibility in addition to the clinical evidence, whereas evidence-based medicine, generally speaking, only considers the clinical evidence and is regardless of the plausibility, which doesn't work when you're dealing with implausible treatments. And so it was exploited by alternative medicine. They love evidence-based medicine because you can call anything evidence-based medicine. And if you're highly implausible, not considering plausibility is a huge boon, right? And we were saying, well, no, you really can't interpret the clinical data except in the context of plausibility. And there's a lot of wonky technical statistical aspects to that general principle, but the general principle is you need to look at this whole picture of the science, all the science, not just the evidence, not just the clinical evidence, but all of the science as one cohesive picture.
Yeah, there's a term that I picked up like 8 or 9 years ago called methodolatry, which is the worship of the method, but in terms of medicine, in evidence-based medicine, it's defined as the obscene worship of the randomized clinical trial as the only valid means of determining knowledge. And that's not to say that randomized trials are not in terms of clinical studies, very useful. But if you consider them the be-all and end-all of clinical evidence, which is probably the biggest, what you call the blind spot of evidence-based medicine, then it opens the door to a lot of implausible treatments seeming plausible because you will, yes, they say, okay, meta-analyses or randomized clinical trials, and then above that, meta-analyses, systemic reviews are the top forms of evidence. But if you have a lot of crappy studies, it's garbage in, garbage out. The other thing, of course, is by its very nature, a clinical trial or clinical trials by their very nature will always produce false positives. Because, for instance, if you just take the p less than 0.5, to put it very simplistically, I know statisticians, please don't bitch me out over this, but roughly a perfectly conducted clinical trial, if you have 100 perfectly conducted clinical trials looking at a question, about 5% of them will be positive. But we also know it's much higher than that because there is no such thing as a perfectly conducted clinical trial. And when the treatment is implausible, like for instance homeopathy, it could be considerably higher. And this is what homeopaths exploit, is the false positives.
Yeah, one other wrinkle on that, though, which comes up a lot when I'm talking to my colleagues who are not steeped in science-based medicine, they're trying to understand it. Evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine converge and give you the same answer when you have. It should
be the same thing.
Yeah, right. You're right, but but even in practice, they do converge when the clinical evidence is a home run, right? When we have multiple large double-blind, placebo-controlled trials with high, rigor, high replicability, showing a positive effect with a good effect size, all the good things, right? If you have that, it doesn't matter how plausible it is, really, because if you have a home run on the clinical evidence, even an EBM approach should give you the correct answer. But most of the things that we deal with are not at that level. The clinical evidence is ambiguous. It may be skewing positive or skewing negative, and that's where plausibility is critical. The more ambiguous the clinical evidence, the more critical the plausibility is. But that's kind of where most of the research and the questions are happening. The stuff that's been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, those are settled, right? We're not worried about those things. And yes, for EBM does great when we're dealing with that level of evidence. And it does great when we're dealing with highly plausible subjects. And it completely fails when you're talking about implausible subjects with mixed data. That's where you need an SBM approach. That's where we really separate out, right? Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I mean, basically, I said blind spot because it never even occurred to the doctors who who formulated the evidence-based medicine model that you would not have plausibility of something that reaches the level of randomized clinical trials. That they assume that you have a progression that goes from that you have, and it may not have come in this order because clinical observations can lead to basic science observations and back and forth, but that you have laboratory evidence suggesting that it should work, that you have preclinical evidence suggesting that it should work, like animal models and that sort of thing, and maybe some preliminary clinical evidence that suggests that it should work. And in that case,
and it's not magic.
Evidence-based medicine is fine.
Right. So essentially, in this, you could see this in the writing of evidence-based medicine when they were sort of defining what it is and justifying it. The idea was that there were treatments out there that were being used because they were highly plausible, even though we didn't have empirical evidence to prove that they worked. That was what they were concerned about. And so we need to remove the advantage of being highly plausible and look just at the evidence to tell us if it works or not. So they said, let's just eliminate plausibility as a factor. They didn't even think about the fact that by doing that, they were also eliminating implausibility as a factor. Because why would you even think about or test a highly implausible treatment? So they got utterly blindsided by alternative medicine. And unfortunately, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but these things were happening at the same time. The EBM movement and the rise of alternative medicine were pretty much around the same time, which was unfortunate. And then that's why science-based medicine is specifically a reaction to that, saying, nope, this failed. This is why it failed. This is the correction. And then, interestingly, in the last really 5 or 6 years, a little bit longer, there has been a tremendous increase, in my perspective, you guys can tell me what you think, in terms of statisticians and researchers and people who study the medical literature not really involved in this debate between SBM and EBM, just doing their own thing, essentially proving all the points that we were making, about SBM, saying, oh yeah, p-value is, you can't rely upon that. There's lots of p-hacking going on. The literature is overwhelmed with false positives. It should be overwhelmed with false positives the way we do. If you make your cutoff 0.05, the way we do studies, it should be, overwhelmed with false positives. So it's like, yeah, right, that's what we've been saying all along. So they basically backed up our general principles with rigorous statistical analysis showing that it's all correct. And, right? I mean, that's been my experience.
Yeah, and, also, it's, this SBM applies not just to alternative medicine, which is another thing. They're saying, oh, you just made it up so that, that conventional medicine is easy, or gets a pass, or and the answer to that is no.
Yeah, it's kind of like going from Newtonian mechanics to general relativity in a way. Newtonian mechanics being evidence-based medicine in this analogy. It's true, but it's a special case that only deals with highly plausible treatments. And we're saying, nope, you have to generalize it to something that accounts for all speeds and distances, right, or whatever. So the SBM applies across the spectrum of plausibility and quality of evidence, whereas EBM only really works at the highly plausible and or high quality evidence end of the spectrum.
Well, and also I'll just add to that you say it goes beyond just evaluating evidence. It gets into statistics, but also it gets into like the All Trials Initiative, where so much research is done and it's file drawered. If it's done by like a corporation or an entity and they don't get the result they want, they shelve and it's never made public. So something like the All Trials Initiative is where someone doing research will file that ahead of time and say, here's what we're going to do, and we will make our data public. So that way, even if it's negative, then everyone has access to it. So you can do everything the right way, but if it's not released into the public domain, then you still get poor overall net effect of the evidence.
Yeah, there's publication bias, there's citation bias, and there's p-hacking, and you can solve a lot of that by pre-registering not only that you're doing a trial, but your methods.
Your planned analyses.
Yes.
So you're not doing all these post hoc, these post hoc analyses are analyses you make up after you have the data, which is not, it's okay if you're doing it as a hypothesis generating tool.
Exploratory,
But if you're trying to make some, it's exploratory.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to make some conclusions based on
cheating.
it's a lot more difficult.
If I can just put in a plug here, I have a 10-part lecture series on science-based medicine that covers a lot of these issues.
On sale in a table outside?
It's free on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay, diabetes. Although not an infectious disease, it appears that diabetes has developed into a global epidemic. I'm wondering if pseudoscience has been used to block effective public policy initiatives to address this health challenge.
Anyone have any thoughts on that?
What kind of pseudoscience did you have in mind? Any?
I mean, all I could say is, I'm assuming you're talking about type 2 diabetes. Right. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, usually hits earlier in life. Right. Type 2 is related to obesity. Yeah, and that, I think it's tracking with the obesity epidemic, which is why it is. I cannot think off the top of my head of any pseudoscience directed at type 2 diabetes specifically, or one that's impeding public health measures to deal with it. The public health measures to deal with it still revolve around diet and exercise, which is correct.
Yeah, I can't speak to the public health element, but I have come across plenty of times in investigations pseudoscientists who are claiming to treat type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes. I went to a Mind, Body, Spirit festival in Manchester, UK, and there's an Ayurvedic store there that was selling an Ayurvedic, so obviously Indian traditional medicine juice that they said will cure diabetes, and in 6 weeks your doctor will tell you to stop taking insulin. And I said, okay, and is this for like type 2 or type 1? Oh, it's for either. It doesn't matter. In 6 weeks you can just stop taking insulin completely. So those claims are out there, and Also, I didn't mention it in my talk, but when I talked about the homeopathic owl that I bought and how that was an unlicensed medicine and they were breaking the law by selling me it, one of the other things I did was look for other unlicensed medicines, and I bought some homeopathic sunlight from the biggest producer of homeopathy in the UK, and they the supplier to all the pharmacies, and they broke the law by selling me those. But I also bought some homeopathic diabetes medicine, and these are sugar pills you give to people to stop them having to take insulin for diabetes, and you know that comes with a death toll ultimately in the wrong hands. And one of the things we did was actually report those to the MHRA who regulate medicines, and got those taken out of the stores. But this is the thing I think with alternative medicine, that when you have people who are such absolute true believers in their particular therapy, they aren't limited in what they think it will treat, because, hey, this definitely works. It's a whole new system of medicine, so why don't I use it to treat measles and diabetes and AIDS and everything else, really?
I saw a full-page ad in a newspaper back in Baton Rouge one time from a chiropractic endocrinologist targeting type 2 diabetes. And I think this is one of those areas.
The fact that there is someone who calls himself a chiropractic endocrinologist is very frightening.
That'd be tough to adjust a pancreas.
But of course, then I've dealt with naturopathic oncologists.
Oh, exactly. And I think with type 2 diabetes, it's one of those things where they probably also promote things like weight loss and exercise and diet, and then the adjustment can get the credit if they get off their.
I think they're going into things like that because they're finding out that chiropractic adjustments really don't work for everything.
Yesterday, you seemed to say at one point that factory farming was necessary to create enough calories. And so I was thinking, if we want to have enough calories, sustainable calories for a sustainable population, wouldn't a decrease in meat, a 100% female literacy, and full access to birth control work better than factory farms?
Well, I think it's a false choice. So first of all, decreasing meat consumption absolutely increases the efficiency of our calorie production. You know, yes, meat is an extremely inefficient way to produce calories. It's the most demanding on the environment as well. There's no question about that. And the other part of the question was related to population control, which is fine, but that takes a long time, you know, to have an effect. And you know, we need to feed even just feeding the 7.5 billion people that exist right now. Even if we can't stabilize the population, we still need to, you know, produce enough calories to feed the world. Also, in my opinion, even if we do stabilize the population, even, you know, reduce the population a little bit, and maximize the efficiency, you know, we're using a lot of the land on the planet for farming. I think that the figure is like over 40%, you know, for farming, and that has the biggest impact on the environment of anything else, and that's been clearly shown now as well. So, if we could reduce our land use by optimizing efficiency of calorie production, then that would be helpful. That would be the biggest thing we could do for the environment, is to reduce the amount of the Earth's land that we need to do to farm. Right? There's nothing that says that we need to continue to use as much land as we're using for farming. So any efficiency is going to be an advantage, in my opinion. Insects is great. Yeah, insects are great. The microfarming. We will be eating more and more insects in the future. Like, there's no question about that. And it's fine. You grind them up into a powder and you got protein. It's good. A crash in the population? Yeah, I am.
In terms of language to communicate, actually using the proper language to communicate certain medical advice. For example, I was diagnosed with diabetes about 15 years ago, and very clearly I was told, you have diabetes. Don't listen to people that say pre-diabetes. And even to this day, I still see medical professionals using that term, and I've even seen advertising in hospitals saying that you may have prediabetes if these conditions are true. Is this something that you're seeing in the medical profession in any sense, that terms that maybe weaken a diagnosis and communication of that diagnosis to the patient may have detrimental effects?
Anyone want to start?
Well, there are criteria for these
Yeah.
diagnoses, and if you don't quite meet the criteria for type 2 diabetes, you may be labeled as having prediabetes, and that's just a red flag that lifestyle
you're
changes,
at risk, yeah.
that you're at risk for it. So I don't necessarily see the downside to that.
So, or like you can make the same case with like osteoporosis and osteopenia. You know, like, so we have terms, we have strict diagnostic criteria when there is a number, you know, that is assigned to it. So yes, you need to have a certain fasting blood glucose or 2-hour glucose tolerance test or whatever, and there are numbers that equal this is diabetes, this is pre-diabetes, this is normal. And if you're in the pre-diabetes range, then your doctor's likely to tell you, well, that's your literal diagnosis. But I think your question is, you know, should we really be communicating to patients in the technical terminology that we use, you know, to do research and to know how to treat patients or whatever? Do patients really need to know that they have pre-diabetes instead of diabetes? And will that be counterproductive in managing them? And that's a good question, and I don't know if there's any one definitive answer for that. I think that gets into the context of the overall communication to the patient. It could be fine either way. We tend to default to just being technically accurate, even if it may not be optimal from an emotional point of view for the patient because of our ethics. You know, we have to be honest with patients. And then, you know, like my approach would be to say, you have pre-diabetes, but this is what that means. You know, that doesn't mean that it's not a problem that we need to address. What it means is that if you A, B, and C, right? If you do these things, your risk of developing these negative outcomes is much better. So yeah, but we do it because we have to be technically accurate, but we have to think about how we're communicating to patients. And it can get very tricky because we have that pesky honesty thing, you know, that we have to adhere to, which other practitioners don't. You know, they tell patients they can optimize their message for, you know, the outcome that they want for dealing with the patient, and that they're not bound by accuracy or transparency or informed consent or honesty. And for us, it's a delicate balancing act. I think we have time for one more, so this will be the last one.
Is immunotherapy the future of cancer treatment, or has it pretty much hit its peak?
Okay, I'm actually old enough to remember some things. Immunotherapy has been something that's come in and out of favor ever since the 80s. Steve Rosenberg at the NCI National Surgery Branch was one of the pioneers, and I've lived through the era of, and it was actually surprisingly a lot of surgeons doing this sort of treatment. One of the attending surgeons where I did a residency used to, remove T cells and reinfuse them, and these patients would end up in the ICU with cytokine storm syndromes. That being said, the immunotherapy with the checkpoint inhibitors that have been developed over the last several years does seem to be more promising than previous flavors of immunotherapy. But I would say whether it's peaked or not, I don't know. It's not my area. I am quite sure it's not going to be the be-all and end-all. For one thing, yes, you can get some really dramatic responses, possibly even cures of surprisingly advanced cancers with various types of immunotherapy. But on the other hand, that also usually ends up being a fairly small percentage of the actual patients. So I'd say a lot more. I'd say it's promising, but I don't think it's going to be the be-all and end-all. And whether it's peaked or not, I have no idea. I mean, if they could find better, if they can find better ways to manipulate the immune system to attack cancer, I suspect they will in the future. It's just, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't really predict.
Isn't it, my perspective, you tell me if you agree, David, that for all of these great innovative cancer treatments, they end up being incremental and partial, right? They keep pushing us forward, but none of them turn out to be the one cure for all cancer.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you a personal experience. Back in the 1990s, when I was doing my fellowship in surgical oncology, I ended up in a laboratory that was interested in angiogenesis inhibitors, inhibiting the tumor's ability to make blood vessels grow into itself to feed it so it could keep growing. And I don't know, have you heard of Judah Folkman? Do you remember? He was one of the great pioneers in anti-angiogenesis therapy. And while he was pretty realistic about it, he got some, in animal models, he got some incredible results of shrinking tumors away to nothing, a dormant ball of cells. And he had a famous quote that he basically said, "If you're a mouse, we can cure your cancer." And it turns, there was a lot of hype in the late 90s about angiogenesis inhibitors as the one true cure for almost every cancer. Turns out it wasn't the case. Turns out it ended up, like Avastin and other angiogenesis inhibitors that were put into the armamentarium along with a bunch of other treatments, and it was an incremental advance.
Incremental, yeah. All right, well, thank you all very much for joining us for Science-Based Medicine Day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
May I make a few quick announcements before you guys dash out? Because another round of applause for our panel. They lost me at eating bugs. I'm sorry. I heard that and I blanched. There are some great ideas brought up here that the number of studies, it's not about the number of studies, it's about the number and quality of those studies. But sadly, the average person doesn't go off and read studies. I guess we all know that. But we still need a method to evaluate them. I think that was a great suggestion by Harriet. And I'm not sure who the person was who asked for the non-snarky synopsis, which I thought was really good. Thank you for that. It gave us a chance to be reminded that clean eating is a marketing tool. It's putting a halo on some food and demonizing others. And it's not science-based. So thank you for that question. For me, the favorite question of this session was whoever asked if we could eliminate one quack therapy, what would it be? Thank you for asking that. And the short list was bogus cancer cures, acupuncture, chiropractors, herbalism, stem cell clinics, and that's the short answer to that. But everyone, wow, day one, everybody, day one. Thank you so much for being here, your attention, your time, your energy, your questions. Go to dinner, have fun. I will see most of you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you.